Thomas, please sit in the back and do not say anything. Melissa said it quietly outside the boardroom, but the words landed harder than if she had raised her voice. She stood beside me in the executive hallway of Redwood Dynamics, holding a presentation folder against her navy suit, while the Denver skyline stretched behind the glass wall. We had been married for 19 years. I had watched her build her career one promotion at a time, and I knew how much that afternoon mattered to her. The board was about to review a $240 million acquisition she had spent months helping develop. What I had not expected was to become the thing she wanted hidden before the meeting even began. Sit in the back? I asked. Melissa glanced toward the closed boardroom doors. Richard said you could observe. That does not mean you need to participate. I see. Thomas, please. This could affect my future here. Jonathan will be watching how I handle the presentation. Rebecca will be watching. Everyone will be watching. I studied her face. She was not angry. She was nervous. Somehow that hurt more. And what exactly are you worried I will do? She exhaled. Ask one of those investment questions that sends everyone down a rabbit hole. Challenge something that does not need challenging. Make people wonder why my husband is inserting himself into a board discussion. My hand tightened slightly around the leather folder I was carrying. Inside it was a memorandum I had finished the night before after reviewing the acquisition materials. Melissa had no idea I had read them. She also had no idea why Richard Bennett had asked me to arrive 30 minutes early. Do you actually believe I do not belong in that room? I asked. Her eyes met mine. For a second, I thought she might soften. Instead, she looked toward the doors again. Today, yes. 3 words. Clean. Controlled. Final. I nodded once. All right. Relief crossed her face so quickly she probably did not realize I saw it. Thank you. Just let me get through this. The boardroom doors opened. Richard Bennett, Redwood's 68-year-old chairman, stood inside speaking with Rebecca Sloan, the lead independent director. The moment Richard saw me, he stopped mid-sentence. Rebecca turned and smiled. Thomas. Good. You made it. Melissa hesitated. She had expected polite recognition. She had not expected familiarity. David Mercer, the chief financial officer, looked up from a stack of documents and gave me a small nod. Morning, Thomas. Melissa glanced at me. You know David? A little. That was easier than explaining the 12 hours we had spent reviewing acquisition financing over the previous week. A board administrator crossed the room carrying a thick voting packet and placed it in front of an empty chair immediately to Richard's right. I saw the label on the cover. Avery, North Designee. Melissa did not. She was already arranging her presentation materials near the screen. Richard looked from the empty chair to me, then toward the row of observer seats along the back wall. He raised one eyebrow. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. He understood. I walked past the board table and took a chair in the back, exactly where my wife had asked me to sit. Melissa looked over, saw me there, and relaxed. She thought the difficult part of her afternoon had just been solved. What she did not know was that every director in the room was waiting for me to take the empty seat beside the chairman. Richard did not call the meeting to order immediately. He glanced at the clock, then at the empty chair beside him, then back at me. Rebecca noticed the exchange and followed his eyes to the observer row. David did the same. Melissa was too busy connecting her laptop to the conference display to see any of it. We have a few minutes, Richard said. Let us get settled. The directors opened their packets, poured coffee, and exchanged the kind of quiet conversation that happens before serious money enters the room. I stayed where Melissa had asked me to sit. A board administrator came toward me carrying another folder. Mr. Avery, would you like your materials back here? She asked. Melissa turned at the sound of my name. He is only observing, she said quickly. The administrator looked at Richard. Richard looked at me. Give them to Thomas, he said. She handed me a thick packet identical to the ones on the board table. Melissa stared at it. Why does he need the full board packet? She asked. Richard answered without looking up. Because he needs the full board packet. That should have been enough to make her ask me what was happening. Instead, she found an explanation that fit what she already believed. Avery North probably wants him to review the investment side, she said to Jonathan Price, who had just entered the room. Jonathan, Redwood's chief executive officer, shook my hand as he passed. Good to see you, Thomas. Jonathan. Melissa watched us. You two have met. Jonathan paused. Not in person very often. That was true. Most of our conversations happened through scheduled capital reviews. usually with Richard and David present. Melissa nodded as though that solved it. To her, I was still the quiet investment husband who knew a few executives because Avery North had money in the company. She did not understand that every person at that table knew my name for a different reason. Rebecca knew because she had reviewed governance rights with our counsel. David knew because he had spent the previous week sending me acquisition models. Richard knew because I had asked him years earlier to help build a board strong enough to challenge management rather than flatter it. Jonathan knew because major capital decisions eventually reached Avery North. Melissa knew me because we shared a home, a mortgage, 18 years of memories, and a kitchen table where I had tried more than once to explain what my work had become. Somehow, she understood the least. The board administrator returned to the empty chair beside Richard and straightened the voting packet. I could see the cover clearly from the back row. Avery North designee. Beneath it sat a pen and a formal voting sheet. Melissa crossed the room to speak with Jonathan before her presentation. As she passed the chair, she glanced at the packet for half a second. Her eyes touched the words Avery North. Then she kept walking. No question. No pause. She had seen the company name so many times that it had become invisible to her. Richard leaned back and looked at me again. "Thomas," he said, "are you comfortable back there?" Melissa turned quickly. I smiled once. For the moment. Rebecca lowered her eyes, hiding a reaction. David cleared his throat. Jonathan looked from me to the empty chair. Melissa noticed all of them noticing. For the first time that afternoon, uncertainty appeared on her face. She looked at the empty seat, then at me, then back at Richard. The room knew something she did not. Melissa kept looking toward the empty chair, but Richard finally called the meeting to order before she could ask another question. The uncertainty stayed on her face as she returned to the front of the room and opened her presentation. I sat in the back with the board packet across my knees and listened. She was good. That mattered. Melissa understood Redwood, understood the strategic logic behind the acquisition, and knew how to hold a room without raising her voice. I had always admired that about her. What had changed over the years was not her competence. It was the way she had started measuring competence in everyone else. Somewhere along the way, titles became evidence. Visibility became achievement. Rooms like this became proof that a person mattered. My life offered very little of that proof. Most mornings, I left our house before 6 in an 8-year-old Chevrolet Silverado with nearly 100,000 miles on it. The driver's seat had a crease near the edge, the radio occasionally lost connection, and the truck still carried a faint smell of sawdust from a weekend project 2 summers earlier. Melissa had asked more than once why I did not replace it. I always gave the same answer. It ran. My office at Avery North Holdings was not much more impressive. We occupied 2 floors of a brick building outside downtown Denver, with clean conference rooms, practical furniture, and a small metal sign near the entrance. No marble lobby. No private elevator. No photograph of me 10 feet tall behind a reception desk. I spent my days reviewing operating reports, meeting management teams, studying debt structures, and deciding where patient capital could create value over 10 or 20 years. The work was quiet because I wanted it quiet. Ownership became harder when everyone performed for the owner. I preferred hearing what plant managers said before they realized who controlled the capital budget. I preferred walking a factory floor in work boots instead of arriving with 6 people carrying folders behind me. Melissa used to understand that. In the early years of our marriage, she would sit at the kitchen table while I worked through investment cases and ask why one company deserved another chance while another did not. She knew the names of the first businesses Avery North backed. She remembered when we nearly walked away from a warehouse automation deal in Utah. She celebrated when our first manufacturing investment finally turned profitable. Then her own career accelerated. Promotions came. Conferences multiplied. Her calendar filled with strategy retreats, executive dinners, and board preparation sessions. I was proud of every step, but our conversations changed. When I mentioned a new acquisition, she heard another investment. When I told her Avery North had increased its position in Redwood, she heard portfolio management. When I explained that our voting interest had crossed into control, she nodded while answering an email. I did not become smaller. She simply started measuring differently. That was her mistake. Mine was letting the distance grow without forcing an honest conversation about it. Silence felt dignified until I realized it was becoming a wall. At the front of the boardroom, Melissa advanced to the next slide and began explaining the acquisition target's projected growth. She looked confident again. Then Rebecca interrupted with a question about customer concentration. Melissa answered smoothly. David followed with a question about financing assumptions. She handled that too. Richard said nothing. He only glanced toward the empty chair beside him, then toward me. On the packet resting there, the words Avery North designee remained visible. Melissa was presenting to a board that already knew why I was in the room. She was the only person still trying to decide whether I belonged there. Melissa moved deeper into the acquisition model, explaining projected revenue growth, integration savings, and the strategic advantage Redwood would gain by bringing the target company into its industrial technology platform. Her voice was steady again. She had recovered from the uncertainty that followed me into the room, and for a while the board let her work. I listened from the back row while David Mercer turned pages in his financial packet and Jonathan Price watched the directors for signs of resistance. Rebecca Sloan asked another question about customer concentration. Melissa answered it with confidence. Richard Bennett remained quiet, one hand resting near the unused voting packet beside him. Every few minutes, his eyes shifted toward me. I knew what he was waiting for. The appointment documents had been completed that morning. Avery North had exercised its contractual right to designate the replacement for the director who retired 2 weeks earlier. The board administrator had confirmed everything before I arrived. I had planned to tell Melissa after the meeting because I did not want my appointment becoming part of her preparation or changing how she presented the transaction. I wanted her work judged on its own. Then she had met me outside the boardroom and told me to sit in the back. Now the empty chair felt heavier with every minute. Melissa advanced to a slide describing the target company's operating footprint. Jonathan interrupted to clarify a manufacturing assumption. While they spoke, the board administrator quietly approached Richard and placed one additional document on top of the packet beside him. From where I sat, the heading was easy to read. Avery North designee. Rebecca noticed it first. Her eyes moved from the paper to me. David followed. Richard did not move at all. Melissa finished answering Jonathan and turned back toward the screen. She never saw the exchange. That was almost the story of our marriage by then. The information was there. She simply looked somewhere else. A few minutes later, she walked toward the board table to distribute a summary sheet. When she reached Richard's side, she set one copy near the empty chair. Her hand passed directly over the packet. For half a second, her eyes dropped to the cover. Avery North designee. She paused. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but I did. Her gaze moved toward me. I held it. She looked back at the packet, then at Richard. Is Avery North sending someone for the vote? She asked. Richard leaned back slightly. They already did. Melissa glanced around the table. Every chair except the one beside Richard was occupied. She looked toward the back row again. Her expression changed, but only slightly. She was still searching for an explanation that did not involve me. I thought Thomas was only here to observe. Richard looked at me before answering. Did Thomas tell you that? Melissa went still. No. Then perhaps you should not assume it. The room became quiet in a different way. Not dramatic. Just attentive. Melissa gathered the remaining summary sheets and returned to the front. Her next slide appeared, but her rhythm had changed. The confidence was still there. So was the competence. Now there was something else beneath it. Doubt. She continued speaking, yet every few sentences her eyes drifted toward the empty chair. Richard rested one hand on the back of it. Rebecca closed her pen. David glanced at me again. Melissa finally understood that the seat was not waiting for some executive running late. What she still did not understand was why everyone seemed to be waiting for me. The first company I ever invested in had one loading dock, 87 employees, and a control system so outdated that the plant manager kept replacement parts in a locked cabinet because he was afraid they would become impossible to find. I was 29 years old, working out of a rented office with 2 desks and a coffee maker that leaked onto the counter. Avery North did not look like a holding company then. It looked like a man with too many spreadsheets and not enough sleep. The industrial controls business was struggling, but the customers were loyal and the engineers knew their work. I bought a minority position because I believed the company could survive if someone gave management enough time to fix what short-term investors wanted solved overnight. It took 3 years. We replaced equipment, renegotiated debt, rebuilt customer contracts, and stopped chasing projects that created revenue without profit. When the company finally stabilized, I learned the lesson that shaped everything Avery North became. Ownership was not about having the loudest voice in the room. It was about staying responsible when everyone else wanted an exit. The next investment was a warehouse automation company in Utah, then a specialty manufacturer in Missouri. After that came logistics, industrial software, robotics, and equipment services. Some deals worked quickly, others took years. A few failed despite everything we did. There were no overnight fortunes, no dramatic photographs beside private jets, no moment when I suddenly woke up wealthy. There was only accumulation. One factory, one balance sheet, one management team at a time. Avery North grew because we stayed longer than most investors wanted to stay, and because we learned to distinguish a damaged business from a useless one. By my early 40s, we were no longer buying small minority positions just to participate. We were providing permanent capital, taking controlling stakes, appointing directors, and accepting responsibility for companies with thousands of employees. Redwood came later. 6 years earlier, the company was still respected, but its balance sheet had become strained after 2 expensive expansion programs and a slowdown in several major industrial markets. Avery North started with a minority position. We did not arrive with a takeover plan. We arrived with capital and patience. Then institutional investors began reducing exposure. We bought more. Another funding round came 18 months later. We participated again. By the time our voting interest crossed 54%, Avery North had become the controlling shareholder. Melissa knew every piece of that history in isolation. She knew I invested in Redwood. She knew the position grew. She knew Richard became chairman. What she never seemed to hold on to was what those facts meant together. At the front of the boardroom, she continued explaining the acquisition while I sat in the back and remembered the years that had brought me there. 20 years of plants, debt, payroll, mistakes, and responsibility had led to one empty chair beside Richard. I had never needed that chair to know what I had built. But watching my wife glance toward it again, I realized she might need it before she finally understood. Redwood became personal long before Melissa understood how much of my life was tied to it. 6 years earlier, the company was still respected across the industrial technology market, but respect did not pay debt. 2 expansion programs had cost more than expected, several major customers had delayed orders, and working capital was tightening at exactly the wrong time. Avery North entered with a minority investment because I believed the operating business was stronger than the balance sheet made it look. We provided capital, helped refinance part of the debt, and gave management room to stabilize the company without cutting every long-term project just to make the next quarter look better. Then one institutional investor decided to leave. We bought most of its position. Another shareholder reduced exposure the following year. We bought again. By the time Avery North reached 54% of the voting shares, control had arrived gradually rather than dramatically. There was no celebration, no press conference, no photograph of me standing beside a Redwood sign. I had never wanted one. I asked Richard Bennett to strengthen the board because I trusted him to challenge management without turning every disagreement into a contest of ego. Jonathan Price remained responsible for daily operations. David Mercer managed the financial organization. I stayed where I believed an owner should stay unless something truly required me. Close enough to understand the business, far enough away that executives could still think for themselves. Major capital decisions came through Avery North. Significant governance changes came through the board. My job was not to approve every purchase order or tell managers how to run factories. My job was to make certain the people doing those things had enough capital, enough accountability, and enough independence to make good decisions. Melissa knew Redwood was one of our largest holdings. She knew Avery North had increased its position. She knew Richard and I had worked together for years. She even knew I reviewed Redwood capital plans. What she had stopped understanding was scale. Because I did not arrive at headquarters in a black car or appear beside Jonathan at company events, she assumed professional managers had taken over most of what I once controlled. Because Richard chaired the board, she assumed I was simply an investor he respected. Because I worked from a quiet office and came home in the same old Silverado, she concluded that my role had become smaller. I never lied to her. But I also stopped correcting every assumption. That was where privacy became distance. I told myself that real authority did not need explanation. In business, that was often true. In marriage, it was not. At the front of the boardroom, Melissa continued presenting the acquisition as if the room beneath her feet were stable. She explained projected integration savings and the strategic value of the target company's customer base. Jonathan nodded along. Rebecca made notes. David kept one finger between 2 pages of the financial model. Richard listened without interrupting. I remained in the back row, watching the woman I loved explain a transaction involving a company I had spent 6 years helping stabilize. She was good at her job. I wanted that fact to survive everything that happened next. Then Richard called for a 10-minute break before the final section of the presentation. Chairs moved. Coffee cups were refilled. Melissa closed her laptop and walked directly toward me. She stopped beside my seat, lowered her voice, and glanced toward the board table before speaking. Thomas, please do not ask anything when we start again. I looked up at her. The empty director chair was still waiting beside Richard. This time, Jonathan was close enough to hear every word. Jonathan looked over before I answered. Melissa noticed him and immediately lowered her voice another degree. I mean it, Thomas. This is already stressful enough. I closed the board packet resting across my knees. What exactly do you think I am going to ask? I do not know. That is the problem. Jonathan smiled as he walked toward us with a fresh cup of coffee. Do not worry, Melissa. We will keep the shareholder spouses under control. He meant it as a joke. Melissa laughed. Just a little. Barely more than a breath. But I heard it. So did Richard. I saw his head lift from the other end of the board table. Rebecca stopped speaking to David. The room did not become silent all at once. It tightened. Melissa seemed to realize too late that the joke had traveled farther than she intended. I looked at Jonathan first. Shareholder spouse? His smile weakened. Just teasing. Then I looked at Melissa. Is that how you see me? Thomas, please do not turn this into something personal. You came over here during a board meeting to tell your husband not to speak. I think we crossed into personal before I asked a question. Her jaw tightened. I am trying to protect months of work. From me. She glanced toward Jonathan, then toward the directors. That glance hurt more than the laugh. Even now, she was measuring the room before answering me. From unnecessary complications. I let the phrase sit between us. Unnecessary complications. 19 years of marriage reduced to something that might interrupt a presentation. I kept my voice low. If I had no money, no ownership interest, no title, and no influence anywhere in this company, would talking to me this way suddenly become acceptable? Melissa blinked. That is not what this is about. Then answer the question. She looked down at the folder in her hands. I just need today to go well. That is not an answer. Jonathan shifted beside her. The humor had left his face. Thomas, I am sure Melissa did not mean anything by it. I am not asking you. He went quiet. Melissa finally looked at me. For a second, I saw the woman who used to sit at our kitchen table and challenge my investment assumptions because she cared enough to understand them. Then the executive mask returned. Can we please finish the meeting? She asked. I nodded. Of course. Relief touched her face again. She thought restraint meant surrender. I reopened the packet. She turned toward the front of the room. That was when Richard set his pen down. The sound was small, but every director heard it. Before we continue, he said, there is an administrative matter we need to correct. Melissa stopped walking. Richard looked toward the empty chair beside him, then toward me in the back row. Jonathan followed his gaze. Rebecca already knew what was coming. Richard placed one hand on the thick voting packet labeled Avery North designee. Thomas, he said evenly. I have been patient because I assumed you had a reason for sitting back there. Melissa turned slowly. I said nothing. Richard looked directly at her, then back at me. But since we are about to resume a meeting that requires 9 directors, perhaps someone should explain why our 9th director is sitting in the back of the room. Melissa did not move. Jonathan stood beside her with his coffee halfway to his mouth, the joke from a few seconds earlier gone completely. Richard waited. Nobody rescued the silence. I closed the packet on my knees and stood. The walk from the back row to the board table was less than 20 feet, but I felt every step. Melissa watched me pass her. Her expression was not anger anymore. It was calculation giving way to confusion. Richard pulled out the empty chair beside him. Thomas, this is your seat. I placed my folder on the table, but remained standing for a moment. I was asked to sit in the back. Richard looked toward Melissa. She lowered her eyes. He did not embarrass her further. That explains where you were sitting, he said. It does not change where you belong for this meeting. Rebecca opened the governance packet in front of her. The appointment became effective at 9 this morning, she said. Melissa looked at her. Appointment. Rebecca nodded. The board seat vacated by Robert Ellis 2 weeks ago. David turned a page in his materials as if the information were routine. For everyone at the table except Melissa, it was. Richard continued. Under the shareholder agreement, Avery North has the right to designate a director to that seat. The designation documents were completed this morning. Melissa looked at me. You? I sat down. Me? Her face lost another layer of confidence. You are on the board? As of this morning. Why did you not tell me? There was hurt in the question, but also disbelief. I planned to tell you after the meeting. After. I did not want my appointment affecting your presentation. Your work deserved to be judged on its own. That landed differently than she expected. She looked toward the screen, then at the notes in her hands. So everyone knew? Richard answered. The directors knew. Governance Council knew. The board administrator knew. Melissa looked at Jonathan. His expression told her he had known too. She turned back to me. And you let me tell you to sit in the back. You did not ask why I was here. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Rebecca slid the formal voting sheet toward me. You will need this before the final agenda item. Melissa stared at the paper. He is voting today? Richard folded his hands. Every director is. That sentence changed the room again. The acquisition she had spent months preparing was not just being presented in front of me. I would formally vote on it. Melissa looked from my voting sheet to the memorandum inside my leather folder. For the first time, I saw concern that had nothing to do with embarrassment. Thomas, she said carefully, you have reviewed the transaction? David answered before I could. Extensively. She turned toward him. How extensively? David looked at me, then back at her. He has had the full financial model since last week. Melissa went completely still. Richard leaned back. We should continue. She returned slowly to the presentation area. I could see her trying to rebuild her professional rhythm while everything she believed about my role in the room rearranged itself. I did not smile. I did not need the moment to belong to me. I wanted her presentation to stand or fall on the facts. But when she looked toward the board again, her eyes stopped on me first. For the first time in 19 years, my wife was no longer wondering whether I belonged in the room. She was wondering what I already knew. Melissa took a slow breath and returned to the screen. For the next several minutes, she spoke with the discipline of someone trying to keep emotion outside a professional room. I respected that. Her presentation deserved to continue, and I had no intention of using my new seat to make her uncomfortable. Richard let her finish the section on integration planning before he asked whether any directors needed clarification. Rebecca raised a question about regulatory timing. David asked about the financing structure. Melissa answered both. Then her eyes moved toward me. She looked away almost immediately. I had not spoken yet. That seemed to make her more nervous than if I had. Jonathan leaned forward. Before we get into the transaction questions, perhaps we should clarify the governance change for the record. Richard nodded. Agreed. The board administrator read the formal resolution confirming my appointment as Avery North's designated director. The language was dry and ordinary. Effective that morning. Proper notice delivered. Governance Council confirmed. No drama. Melissa listened to every word as though each sentence was rewriting something she thought she understood about our marriage. When the administrator finished, Richard looked around the table. Any objection to recognizing Thomas Avery as the 9th director? Nobody objected. Rebecca gave me a small nod. David already had his pen back on the financial model. Jonathan said nothing. Melissa was not entitled to vote on the matter, but she watched everyone accept my presence without surprise. That seemed to affect her more than the formal resolution itself. During the next pause, she looked at Richard. How long has this been planned? Richard answered evenly. The seat became available 2 weeks ago. Avery North notified us of its designation this morning. And Thomas was the choice from the beginning? Yes. She looked at me. You knew 2 weeks ago? I knew the seat was opening. I made the final decision this week. Why you? The question came out more personal than professional. Richard could have answered for me. I did it myself. Because the acquisition vote involves capital structure, long-term ownership risk, and governance questions I have already been reviewing. Melissa frowned. As an investor? As the person responsible for Avery North's position? She looked at the name on the packet again. I thought Avery North had professional managers handling most of that now. We do have professional managers. Then why does the board seat belong to you? I held her gaze. Because delegating operations is not the same as giving away responsibility. The room stayed quiet. Melissa looked down at her notes. I could see years of assumptions beginning to lose their shape. She knew Avery North was a major shareholder. She knew the firm had backed Redwood through difficult years. What she had never really absorbed was that I had not stepped away from the decisions that mattered. Richard folded his hands. Avery North has contractual governance rights because of its ownership position. Thomas is exercising one of those rights today. Melissa looked toward him. How much influence does Avery North actually have here? Richard glanced at me before answering. Enough that this board takes its responsibilities to that shareholder very seriously. He stopped there. The full answer could wait. I wanted the transaction judged before ownership became the loudest thing in the room. Melissa seemed to understand that something larger was still being held back. She turned to the final section of her presentation. All right, she said quietly. Let us continue. She advanced to the acquisition risk assumptions. I opened the memorandum I had completed the night before. David noticed. Rebecca noticed. Melissa noticed too. She looked at the pages in front of me, then at my face. Richard leaned back in his chair. Thomas, he said, you have been unusually patient. I rested one hand on the memorandum. I wanted Melissa to finish. She swallowed. I am finished. The room turned toward me. I looked down at the first question I had written 12 hours before my wife told me not to speak. I looked at Melissa, then at David, and finally at the first page of my memorandum. The target company gets 38% of its revenue from 2 customers, I said. What happens to the model if one of them reduces orders by 20% next year? Melissa answered quickly. The downside case assumes moderate customer attrition. Moderate is not a number. David turned several pages. Melissa looked toward him. 8% blended attrition. I nodded. Then the downside case is not really testing concentration risk. The room became quieter. Melissa did not retreat. We believe both customers are stable. Based on what? Renewal history, management interviews, and purchase forecasts. Have we independently verified the forecasts? David stopped turning pages. Jonathan leaned forward. Management provided supporting documentation. That was not my question. Rebecca looked at David. He adjusted his glasses and said, not independently, no. I made a note. Second question. The target owns 3 older manufacturing sites. The environmental reserve in the model is $6 million. Who validated that number? Melissa looked down at her presentation notes. Their advisors. Their advisors work for the seller. Jonathan shifted in his chair. We have legal diligence underway. Underway means unfinished. Richard said nothing. He did not need to. Melissa's expression had changed. She was no longer embarrassed that I was speaking. She was listening. I continued. Third, integration costs are projected at $14 million over 18 months. David, what happens if employee retention falls below 85%? He opened the financial model. Costs rise materially. How materially? He studied the page. Depending on replacement timing, another $9 to $12 million. Rebecca looked toward Jonathan. Is that included in the downside case? David shook his head. Not fully. The room tightened. Melissa stepped away from the screen and came closer to the table. Thomas, are you saying the acquisition is bad? No. I looked directly at her. I am saying the board does not yet know enough to say it is good at $240 million. Her face softened by a fraction. That distinction mattered. I was not attacking months of her work. Strategy could be sound while price and risk were wrong. Jonathan folded his hands. We have been working on this for 6 months. Time spent is not evidence. He looked at me more carefully. I turned another page of my memorandum. The target also has a customer indemnity provision buried in the supplemental contracts. If the product warranty exposure expands after closing, Redwood inherits it. Has anyone quantified the maximum liability? David looked toward Melissa. Melissa looked at Jonathan. Nobody answered. I had found the clause the previous night at 11:43. My memorandum carried the electronic timestamp. That would matter later. Rebecca broke the silence. I want legal counsel to review that before we vote. Richard nodded. Agreed. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Melissa looked at the memorandum in front of me. How long have you had these concerns? She asked. Since last night. Before this morning? Yes. Her eyes stayed on mine. She understood what I was telling her. Whatever happened between us outside the boardroom had not created my doubts about the deal. I had walked into the meeting already prepared to challenge it. David closed the financial model. Thomas is right about one thing. Our downside analysis is too narrow. Rebecca nodded. Another director asked for the customer concentration schedule. A second requested the environmental reports. The conversation shifted away from Melissa and toward the transaction itself, exactly where it belonged. She returned to her seat near the presentation screen and listened as the board debated risk for another 40 minutes. When Richard finally called the discussion to a close, nobody looked relaxed. He placed the voting sheet in front of him. Unless anyone wants additional discussion, we will proceed. The directors straightened in their chairs. Melissa looked toward me once. I did not know how the others would vote. I only knew mine. And unlike everything my wife had assumed that morning, I had decided it before she ever told me to sit in the back. Richard looked around the table one final time. We will record the vote in order. The board administrator opened the formal record. Melissa remained near the presentation screen with her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table. She was no longer watching Jonathan. She was watching me. Richard called the first director. Yes. The administrator marked it down. The second director voted yes. Rebecca Sloan was third. No. Richard nodded once. The fourth director voted yes. 3-1. David Mercer came next. He looked at the financial model for several seconds before answering. No. 3-2. The sixth director voted no. 3-3. Nobody moved. The seventh director looked toward Jonathan, then toward Richard. Yes. 4-3. One director remained before me. She had spent most of the discussion listening without speaking. When Richard called her name, she closed the acquisition packet and said, no. 4-4. Silence settled across the room. Not the awkward silence that follows a mistake. This one had weight. 8 directors had spoken. 4 wanted the acquisition approved. 4 did not. The board administrator stopped writing and looked toward Richard. Jonathan leaned back slowly. David rested both hands on the closed financial model. Rebecca looked directly at me. Then, one by one, every other director did the same. Melissa followed their eyes. For most of our marriage, she had assumed my work happened somewhere outside rooms like this. Now an entire boardroom was waiting because I had not spoken yet. Richard turned toward me. Thomas, your vote. For words. Nothing theatrical. Nothing raised. Yet they seemed to erase every sentence Melissa had said outside the room that morning. Sit in the back. Do not say anything. Do not embarrass me. I looked down at the memorandum in front of me. The electronic timestamp showed I had completed it the night before. My concerns were already there in black and white before Melissa told me where she thought I belonged. Customer concentration, environmental exposure, integration costs, retention assumptions, unquantified warranty liability. I had not come into that boardroom angry. I had come prepared. That mattered more to me than whether anyone else understood it. Melissa stared at the document too. I could see the realization forming on her face. If I voted against the transaction, she could not honestly tell herself it was revenge. The decision had existed before the humiliation. Richard waited. Nobody rushed me. That was another thing Melissa had misunderstood about authority. Real authority was rarely loud. Sometimes it was simply a room knowing it could not move until you finished thinking. I looked at Jonathan. If we approve today and the customer concentration assumption proves wrong, what is our recovery plan? He answered carefully. We would adjust integration spending and pursue replacement revenue. And if environmental exposure is double the reserve, he paused, we would absorb it. With what capital? David answered this time. Most likely additional debt or an equity contribution. I nodded. From Avery North. He did not argue. Melissa lowered her eyes. The company was asking my holding firm to accept risks the board had not fully measured. That was the decision in front of me. Not my pride. Not my marriage. Not the back row. I closed the memorandum. Richard looked at me. Thomas. Every director waited. Melissa barely seemed to breathe. I placed one hand beside the voting sheet and gave the answer I had known before I entered the building. No. The word stayed in the room for several seconds. No. 5 votes against the acquisition. 4 in favor. Richard looked toward the board administrator. The motion does not pass. Jonathan exhaled and leaned back in his chair. Melissa remained near the screen, completely still. I could see the first assumption forming behind her eyes, and I wanted to stop it before it hardened. For the record, I said, opening my memorandum again. My recommendation is not to abandon the transaction. Rebecca looked toward me. What are you proposing? A 60-day diligence extension. Independent validation of the customer forecasts, environmental reserves, warranty exposure, employee retention assumptions, and integration costs. Then we reconsider valuation. David nodded immediately. I support that. Another director agreed. Jonathan looked less pleased, but he understood the distinction. I was not killing 6 months of work. I was refusing to spend $240 million before we understood what we were buying. Melissa finally spoke. And you decided this before today? I turned the memorandum toward her. The electronic timestamp was printed at the bottom of the first page. 11:43 the previous night. I finished this before midnight. Her eyes stayed on the date. Before I told you to sit in the back. Yes. Something changed in her face. Shame replaced suspicion. Richard asked for a motion to extend diligence. Rebecca made it. David seconded. This time the vote passed unanimously. The acquisition was paused, not destroyed. The room began to settle, but one question remained hanging over Melissa. She looked at Richard. I understand why Thomas had a board vote. What I still do not understand is why Avery North gets to designate the seat. Richard glanced at me. I nodded. There was no reason to hold the second truth back anymore. Avery North holds 54% of Redwood's voting shares, he said. Melissa stared at him. 54. Yes. So Avery North controls Redwood. Correct. Her eyes moved slowly toward me. And Thomas still controls Avery North? Richard answered before I could. He founded it. He remains the managing member. On major ownership decisions, he has the final authority. The room went quiet again. Melissa looked at me as if she were seeing 19 years of conversations from the wrong direction. You control the company I work for. Through Avery North, yes. And you never told me? That hurt because it was not true. I did tell you. Not in one dramatic sentence, because there was never a dramatic moment. I told you when our ownership crossed 50%. I told you when Richard joined the board. I told you when Avery North received additional governance rights. She looked down. I remember pieces. That is the problem. Jonathan shifted in his chair, but Richard gave him a look that kept him silent. This was no longer a board discussion. Melissa looked back at me. Why did you let me believe you had stepped away? I never told you I stepped away. My voice stayed level. You saw the old truck, the quiet office, the managers running daily operations, and you decided those things meant I had become less important. She swallowed. Thomas. I shook my head once. This is not about whether I am important. I looked around the table. That is exactly what I do not want anyone to misunderstand. Then I looked back at my wife. If Richard had never pulled out that chair, if I had no vote, no ownership, and no title at all, you still should not have been ashamed to have me in the room. Melissa lowered her eyes. Nobody spoke. The acquisition decision was finished. The more difficult vote was the one our marriage had been avoiding for years. The 60-day diligence extension changed more than the transaction. Independent review confirmed that the customer concentration risk was higher than management had modeled. Environmental exposure at one manufacturing site could exceed the reserve by several million dollars, and retention costs after closing were likely to be almost twice the original estimate. Redwood did not walk away. We renegotiated. The final purchase price dropped, additional protections were written into the agreement, and the seller accepted responsibility for several liabilities that would otherwise have landed on our balance sheet. Melissa's strategic logic had been sound. The problem was not her work. The problem was that everyone, including her, had become too eager to believe the first version of the deal. She kept her position. Her performance remained strong. I made certain my marriage had no place in any decision involving her career. At home, there was no governance committee to protect us from ourselves. 3 nights after the board meeting, Melissa sat across from me at our kitchen table and stared at the empty chair beside mine. If Richard had never pulled that chair out, she said, I would still believe you belonged in the back. I did not answer immediately. That was the sentence I had been waiting for without knowing it. She looked down. I kept thinking I was embarrassed by you. I was really embarrassed by what I thought other people might think of me because of you. Her voice broke slightly, but she kept going. That is worse. Yes, I said. She nodded. No defense. No explanation. Just truth. Then I gave her mine. I also let you misunderstand me for too long. She looked up. You told me things. In pieces. And when you stopped listening, I stopped trying. I told myself privacy was strength. Sometimes it was pride. Sometimes it was easier to withdraw than admit I wanted my wife to understand what mattered to me. Neither confession repaired 19 years in one night. 2 weeks later, I moved into a furnished apartment 6 miles from the house. We agreed on separation, counseling, and no promises about the outcome. Melissa began individual counseling before I asked. I started my own sessions too. For the first 3 months, we met every other Sunday at a quiet diner outside downtown Denver. No directors, no board packets, no presentation screens. We talked about ordinary things until we became brave enough to talk about the important ones. 6 months after the meeting, Melissa invited me home for dinner. My Silverado was still in the driveway where it had always been. She opened the door wearing jeans and a gray sweater. We ate at the same kitchen table where so many conversations had disappeared into silence. After dinner, she looked at the chair across from her and said, "I spent years worrying about which rooms I belonged in. I stopped asking whether I was making room for you." I felt the words settle somewhere deeper than anger had ever reached. I pulled out the chair and sat down. No voting packet waited there. No chairman had saved it. No director needed my decision. Just my wife, looking at me without checking who else was watching. I reached across the table and took her hand. Not because everything was fixed. It was not. Not because one board meeting had taught us everything. It had not. We still had work ahead of us. But for the first time in years, neither of us was measuring the other by a title, a seat, or the approval of a room. We did not promise forever that night. We promised honesty. We promised to ask before assuming. We promised to listen before silence became distance again. And this time, when I sat beside my wife, neither of us needed anyone else to confirm that I belonged there.